Hello, snails. This is autistic. Back at it again with another commentary. This is probably going to be the most unscripted and most, I don't know, informal video. And I'm gonna try to do it in one shot this time because I think it's going to make a lot cleaner product, even if I make a few hiccups here and there. And the topic of this rant or little mini video essay is that I am no longer an autistic nationalist. In fact, I despise it altogether. Well, not despise, but more like denounce. And to be clear, this will not mean that I'm leaving the ASD Republic. The movement so far is very innocent, although I don't like to use that diction for reasons I'll explain later, maybe in this video. And the reason why I'm leaving the autistic nationalism but not the ASD Republic is that the ASD Republic hasn't actually attracted that many fascists, while I think that autistic nationalism definitely will. And also, I don't think that the ASD Republic and its movement, or the Autistic Guild movement, is necessarily going to be autistic nationalist. I think that there could instead be multinationalism, because even though you're trying to make an autistic nation, it doesn't have to be a nationalist nation. Although that may sound a little self-contradictory, it's not an effect, because I think the ASD Republic would only make an autistic nation given it was in desperation or that it wasn't violent, because all the nations are built on violence, especially the US and Israel. However, this does mean that I'm more so in it for the socio-cultural movement, because it's just going to devolve into a new racism if autistic people don't actually have a culture. And the reason why I denounce autistic nationalism itself, because, well, it was attracting fascists, but that's not what this video is about so much. Because while that is important to avoid fascism, there is a deeper point, I think. The thought process behind my decision on whether or not to keep autistic nationalism is a lot more complex. And the biggest reason was definitely that talk with my dad. I think it was right after I left the psych ward, or maybe a day or two later, and I had this really awkward talk with my dad, bringing up like fascism and rightism, that sort of stuff. And I don't want to go in too much detail, but it's really changed my mind. And I don't think that would have been possible if it weren't face to face with a person I actually knew, even if the conversation itself went exactly the same. You see, autistic nationalism, while it may get corrupted, is fundamentally based on left-wing nationalism. And my main inspiration was that one Badmouth video and J.J. McCulloch's video on left-wing nationalism, but especially what Bad Mouse said about Vaush and baby leftism, and moreover, the characteristics of the movements based on oppressor identities versus oppressed identities. So, for example, well, Black Pride, like the Black Pride movements, for example, the Black Panthers, and even the Nation of Islam had very different characters, or had a very different fundamental character, as opposed to white pride, which didn't accomplish much in the long term, except for, World War II needless deaths of German people, ironic as it was caused by Nazism, and the concept of oppressor versus oppressed nationalism really stuck out to me, or the more broad diarchy, the more broad distinction between oppressor and oppressed movements. And so I figured that I turned that into autistic nationalism. And I say this because while it would effectively inspire a lot of fascist movements, I don't think it should in itself be compared to fascism, or at least not equated to fascism, because at its core it has a fundamentally different character as opposed to, say, Nazism or fascism. And I explained it in the original video. However, the reason why, as opposed to why not, is because I wanted an ideology that had a really big punch. I wanted to take what neurodiversity and autism acceptance was doing and make it more radical and make it clear that it was a very radical movement. You see, I like autism acceptance, I like neurodiversity. In fact, I like them to the point where I want to see them go further, much more radical. They have not nearly gone far enough. And I don't think I can expect something as big as, like, land back or something like that. But if rights for autistic people merely had the same punch as trans rights, or if people were as dedicated to the rights of autistic people as they were to the rights of the LGBT community, then I think Outlying would have already been finished. And as someone who has tried to make an autistic conlang themselves, that would be a big step up, although I don't exactly agree with the philosophy of Outlying. It definitely would have been a big evolution to have at least a small community online of those who speak Outlying or an autistic language. But moreover, it's because the opposition, Autism Awareness, which has inspired ABA, Autism Speaks, Next for Autism, Autism Society, the JRC. It's a very big movement, despite it doing all those terrible things, all that church culture, all that MSNG, all that anti-vaxxer nonsense. You see, most people think of autism awareness as just some generic pro-autistic movement, and while it is generic, it's not pro-autistic, not even close. In fact, quite the opposite. But the thing is that it's able to keep that lie going for so long because it works a lot like a cult or religion. In fact, I would argue that it has become a pseudo-religion that has managed to control the world governments in terms of how they treat autistic people. And it's very important to think of this as a sort of cult. Not like Heaven's Gate, not to that extent, but it is a sort of anti-autistic nationalism that has been very well proliferated, and it's through the very same tactics a religion would use, like social facilitation. Like, notice how they're able to get thousands and thousands of people to these Autism Speaks walks every year. And sure, neurodiversity has a little online community that is admittedly pretty big. It's lucky that we've gotten this far. But what do autistic people have, honestly? Lydia XZ Brown going to one of the walks and protesting it. Those informal protests that has like 12 people. There's like a dozen people protesting the JRC. And when I say protest, I mean in person with a little sign. There are only ever like 12 people doing that at a time. Yet the Autism Speaks walks gets thousands and thousands of people. And that's really something to be jealous about. As we all know, the voice of Autism Speaks is a threat to the voice of autistic people. And people have been saying, oh, neurodiversity has been growing. And even if that's actually true, autism awareness has been growing at an even faster pace. Like, you know, the little thing created, like, fix the system, not me. Yeah, well, Autism Speaks has adopted the neurodiversity rhetoric and appeal so that now, if you criticize Autism Speaks like you did in 2005, you would look more like a fool because, oh, they're reforming, they're getting better. And this is despite the fact that, in reality, Autism Speaks still supports ABA, still supports MSNG, and the whole support of neurodiversity. I think there was an article where Autism Speaks got a person who was in favor of neurodiversity debating somebody that had a more outdated view. And the neurodiversity person themselves probably had good intentions. But Autism Speaks is very much willing to exploit that. Now you no longer have stuff like, I am autism, I will rape kids, to love, kindness, acceptance, neurodiversity. It's okay to be a person with autism and rape children. You see how they're still supporting the stereotypes and Kirby rhetoric or Kirby ideology that they had before. But now they're drenching it in the neurodiversity aesthetic. Like how fascism is said to come to America holding a cross and wrapped in an American flag. The most dangerous form of autism awareness is going to come in a red infinity symbol. And I don't care how rich or famous the individual celebrity is. Autism Speaks will get 100 prostitutes and do the same thing. You know, and I say prostitutes because I do want to emphasize the inauthenticity, taking an original autistic idea and reducing it through corporate means. But while I do emphasize the inauthenticity, people don't care about authenticity. They're very easily willing to eat ramen while looking at AI art and stuff like that. They're not going to care whether or not the actual message makes sense or is actually good. Because to the ugly reptile brain, it's all going to be the same. Because, again, it's of the same aesthetic. Autism awareness is so good at taking the neurodiversity movement, or neurodiversity movements, which already have a lot less morale in the first place, a lot less social facilitation. Like, it's honestly easier to just give up and go suck the cock of Autism Speaks. But they'll take what the few people are saying and corrupt it. They stole what Temple Grandin said and tricked her into supporting Autism Speaks and really commodified what she said. They also stole Julia from Sesame Street, which was literally created by Hassan, or at least influenced by Hassan. I forgot the exact history, but you get the point. Likewise, they're probably going to take something like the Proud Family, or at least the general autism awareness movement. They'll take it and corrupt the entire message. People were celebrating, oh, more good autistic representation. And yes, it was good autistic representation. But autism awareness is gonna fuck it up. And again, I do promise that I'm gonna stay away from autistic nationalism, more or less. But honestly, I still have the urge to go back to it because every day I'm inconsistent. Autism's awareness is gonna get stronger and stronger. You know, it's gonna get harder and harder to say stuff like, oh, hey, have you heard of double empathy? Oh, hey, have you heard that autistic people don't naturally have theory of mind deficits or executive dysfunction? And those are very important things to say because while autistic people pragmatically have all those things, it's not natural. And to suggest that it's natural is very dehumanizing. You may as well say that autistic people are animals, or said whatever the fuck Ivar Lovaas said. And it's gonna get a lot harder to present autistic culture as the years go by, because autism awareness is just gonna be there to embarrass autistic people further and reinforce the idea that autistic people are naturally unsocial, and in general the idea of autism itself as described in the DSM-5. Honestly, I think the main problem facing the neurodiversity movement is the morale itself, the ability to get things done as a group. And autistic nationalism is the easiest way to fix that problem, but it's not good in the long term. And I certainly think that there should be some stronger version of neurodiversity. Perhaps alt neurodiversity or radical neurodiversity. Something that can further advance the idea of autistic people, or the ideas that autistic people have about themselves. Like, in 2006, there was this little conlang called Autlang, and I don't exactly agree with the philosophy, but I do think it's admirable because it's one of the... Actually, I think it's the first conlang that was specifically made for autistic people to use between each other. And for years, I've tried to make a conlang like that. And I can tell that autistic people are demoralized because despite more people knowing about neurodiversity and the fact that it has more manpower overall, there has never been a second Autlang or anything like it, except for what I have done, but I didn't even finish those conlangs yet. I'm probably gonna do more videos about autistic language and how we can create an autistic language through a combination of conlanging and natural means. But I use conlanging for perspective on morale. Then again, it could just be that most people aren't big into conlanging. It could also be that. That's another factor. But you see my point. And I realized that the neurodiversity movement is very demoralized after looking at myself. I, for a long time, have been trying to push the neurodiversity movement a lot further and further. But I got demoralized anyway, and I got demoralized very badly. Now, this is partially because I was forced into the psych ward. And let me tell you, the forced hedonism they put on you, they force you to eat 3 meals every day and attend the little meetings, which isn't that authoritarian, but considering the fact that I didn't have anything to do all day, I don't think it was overall good for my mental health or social standing in general. But more generally speaking, I'm kind of a flip-flop about this topic, particularly my opinion regarding autistic nationalism, because, well, I genuinely don't know whether or not it's a good thing, or at least I didn't know whether or not it was a good thing. Again, I had that talk with my dad, and after that talk, I would slowly shift to another idea. This wouldn't be based on nationalism, but the idea that autistic people were a lot more abled than neurotypicals, and for society to progress further, autistic people would have to care for neurotypicals, because then when autistic people realize that they're naturally abled, they'll eventually improve themselves so that they can care for neurotypicals, because that would be the natural order. And I actually like this a lot more, or at least a little bit more, because it ensures that there is a sense of autistic responsibility, which is actually pretty contrary to most nationalisms, especially like white nationalism, Nazism. They definitely don't hold themselves morally accountable. In fact, I believe it was Hitler that said that the Jews invented conscience and morality. Ooh! Or something like that. But anyway, I told this to my family, and my dad called me comparing it to racism. It was the same mentality as the people who support racism, he said. And that immediately demoralized me because obviously I hated racism, and it was definitely the opposite of social facilitation. Now, I don't think that was a good ideology either, anyway, but it re demoralized me. Uh, there's this sort of cycle I go through when I become very moralized, have a very clear purpose in life, usually to stop some anti autistic apocalypse or something, to stop the autistic genocide or the rise of a worldwide Walden 2 or JRC. And disregarding whether or not they will actually happen, because whether or not they will actually happen is ultimately beyond me, they kind of feel like an artificial remoralization. Uh, but it's either that for me, or for a long time it was either that or just living an average, mediocre life. And I definitely want my life to be meaningful, and I've definitely attached a lot of meaning to what I've been saying about neurodiversity and what I've been doing to promote autistic pride. But it's always sort of a cycle, and the other side of that cycle is being completely demoralized and going back to, I'm just gonna live my life and, you know, just schizopost a little and just be done with it, or or it's actually a little hard to describe because I want to pinpoint specifically what's been going on, but in a nutshell, I often get moralized by a radical, very anti-hedonistic ideology, very Puritan ideology, and then it goes slowly back, or it may crash down to a more hedonistic ideology. So, in a nutshell, while I do believe that neurodiversity should be more extreme, like 1 or 2 steps or even 10 steps further, it should not be in the direction of autistic nationalism. Instead, well, actually, it should be a lot of things, but I, in particular, instead of being an autistic nationalist, I am an autistic futurist. Now, what that actually means is should be explained by an entire manifesto or something similar. Perhaps a future video, but in a nutshell, it means that I reject all the old ideas about autistic people, specifically, or rather especially, those created by those who are non-autistic and part of the bourgeoisie, and replace them with new ideas about autistic people that are created by the autistic proletariat. Again, I should be more in depth about it, but that's the nutshell version of it. Oh, and also regarding autistic atomization, or rather, more specifically, the atomization in the neurodiversity movement, I figured that I should add a lot more morale to the movement. And luckily, the social autistic contest got greenlit by the ASDR. So please help me in spreading flyers like the ones you see on the screen right now. That's it. Thank you.